More data equals more problems. Stop the insanity. Susan Powder, God bless her. I'm here with the cybersecurity specialist for Fortinet, Mr. Ben Strother. And we have the executive director, actually he's the president of CDSA. I'm the executive director of CDSA, Mr. Richard Atkinson. I think we're getting him live on video. Hey, there he is. Richard, can we hear you? Can you hear us?
Hello.
Hello, there he is. Awesome.
Good.
Hey, as I clack away and get our questions prepped, Ben, why don't you take a second and introduce yourself? And Richard, I'm going to ask the same of you next.
So, hi everybody. My name is Ben Strother.
Is that on? Yeah, good.
So, my name is Ben Strother. I am an engineer with Fortinet. We are a cybersecurity company, and in a former life, I used to work for a studio doing content protection. So, I got to do a lot of, everything from when a film is greenlit all the way up to when a film is direct to consumer. Everything in that window is pre-release, and that was when myself and my colleagues would work to keep those things from being pirated or leaking online. And so data protection very near and dear to my heart.
Awesome. Richard?
Hey there. As Guy said, I'm currently president of CDSA. I'm also a board advisor to a number of primarily media and entertainment companies out there. Spent roughly the last 10 years with the Adobe Corporation, leading a big part of their business, multi-billion-dollar part of their business. And then before that, I was with Electronic Arts as their chief security officer. Before that, 12 years with the Walt Disney Company, driving both CTO roles, CIO role, and also some strategy stuff internal. And before that, I did 15 years with Northrop Grumman Aerospace. So I've got a pretty broad career there. Awesome.
Thank you so much. I'm Guy Finley. I throw parties and people know me. All right. All right, we're here talking about data. We're here talking about evolution, right? And obviously, I spoke earlier in the morning about changing models, D2C, streaming. Now we got FAST, right? The reinvention of AVOD. But with all these new streaming models, we have an increased data flow, obviously, and across a whole different spectrum than when we were the good old, back in the DVD days when it was like, that's not our problem, that's Walmart and Best Buy's problem, right? Or leaving it to the cinemas to track, quote unquote, our customer. But with this revolution and these massive data flows, I mean, can you talk about some of, just to set the stage, and Richard, feel free to chime in as well, some challenges and also maybe some opportunities around this increased data flow and where you see this going, and we're obviously going to dig deep, so feel free to start high, and we'll get right into the weeds before you know it.
So with my customers, what I've tried to help them get their hands around is that, you hear very much like data is the new oil, data is this business valuable asset that we need to be able to gather and quantize and leverage and use in our machine learning, use in our analytics and our consumer insight for things like customer retention, for the things like Ketch was talking about earlier. And I think that that is a definite business opportunity, but you also are creating a lot of risks, and you're kind of increasing your company's attack surface, right? Because you're pulling in personally identifiable information about households now in the direct consumer model. Sure. A lot of those households involve minors, right? So you're now talking about children under 13 and the potential COPA issues around that. Yep. You've got a whole issue around billing and payment card information that otherwise studios wouldn't care about that, right? Of course. So I think that it does require a level of maturity and sophistication of understanding what data are you collecting, where are you keeping that data, how are you securing access to it, who has access to that data, how do you share it both internally and with partners, and it is kind of a new frontier, I think, for a lot of creators of content and media, right? Like, this is not something that they've had to solve before. And so I do think that it is solvable, and there are certainly other standards like PCI DSS that address some of it, and there are regulations. And I do think that the piece that matters is understanding that you have to protect that data from the whole life cycle of when it's acquired, to how you store it, to how you use it, to how you get rid of it eventually, right? Because if it doesn't have a business value, it's now a risk or a liability that you shouldn't keep on the books, right?
Yeah, indeed. And Richard, you have experienced that also, obviously at Disney because of the parks activity and whatnot, right? But you extend that into EA and Adobe where you're getting more and more data and more information and more PII, financial information, like don't even go into accessibility and HIPAA. But I'm curious also, your take on that as well and seeing that really unfold right beneath your
Well, that's the
feet.
thing is over the last 10 years, this kind of D2C data has just exploded, right? And it's become kind of the holy grail, right? I mean, I've been tuning into ESS today, and every session seems to be about data, right? And about leveraging data and how to analyze it and how to find that holy grail, the hidden nugget in there. But and so it is clearly about response and engagement and optimization and personalized experience and all those things. A bunch of it is the same old thing, right? So it has the same old challenges around technical challenges, process challenges, business challenges, right? Because as the business gets focused on it, the business tends to be looking always in some ways for the silver bullet. And so right now, everything is swinging to this as the silver bullet. But the business isn't very patient in most cases. It comes back to what Ben said around maturity, right? The best possible thing you can have is a business that's both highly mature in the way that they think about data and the way that they set their processes up, but at the same time, highly agile, right? And that's a very, very tough thing to achieve. Right? And it means that you have to have smart people working it, but starting to put things into architecture, data models, and a lot of things around getting everybody on the same page. That, and my experience has been that's probably one of the toughest things today. Is that if I took a look at any major company now, especially in media entertainment, that's got to focus on data. They now have the traditional teams. They have an IT team and they have all those kinds of things. But they also have, a brand team that's involved in one way or another, or think they should be involved. They have a privacy team. They have a legal team, which may or may not be the privacy team. They have things like a security team. They have an identity team. They have a sales ops team, they have a marketing team, they have an engagement team. But every one of these teams, in many ways, is a separate element, reporting in some separate way. And I always say they're all on a mission from God, right? They all believe that they are the most important thing. Their executive management, in some ways, has supported we can turn the business around, or we can, squeeze this rock, or we can do this, or we can provide this insight. And so all these business plans, if you want to call them that, are on a convergent crash course, right? And meanwhile, you've got IT and security and others just going, whoa, wait a minute, right? Let's try to figure out how to deal with basic things like what's important in here. Right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, absolutely, Richard. And totally agree. And the other idea is how do you prioritize these things, right? Because I assume also every company is different because every company has a different culture and has a different flavor and a twist. Yes, we're all streaming, but we're all streaming in very different ways and have different models that support it. But how do you go in and prioritize it? And how do you what are some of the things that you have recommended maybe in terms of building that foundation across those teams? Because that's the other thing is you may do it right for one team and another team comes in and is like, whoa, this is totally not what we're looking to do. So I don't know if you have some experience on that side.
I do.
That was a softball.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is that every organization is kind of unique and has their own risk appetite, but there are, sort of guide rails in place of, there's the law, that's kind of the floor, right? You have to comply with that. At least, unless you're an attorney maybe. But in general, the understanding is that that is the minimum compliance. And for me, especially when it comes to things like a data breach around consumer protection of that kind of data, I find that, while it used to be in the information security department, if you're making the business case to the board, you're telling the board, hey, this is going to get you on the front of the Wall Street Journal, and that's not going to be good, and you want to avoid that. I don't necessarily think that that is as persuasive as of an argument as it used to be, because we've had multiple large brands get breached, and it's been a blip on their share price, right? Yep. And so from a shareholder value perspective, the board doesn't care about it from that. But what I would say is, if you look at some of these hacks and you look at the millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of cleanup, remediation, and rebuilding and recovery that go into it, to me, I look at it as it's a momentum and a velocity thing of like, if I'm in a race with my competitors and we're all at the basically equivalent speed and I get tripped up by a data breach, then guess what? They're all way ahead of me now.
Yep.
And I got a lot of catch up to do.
Yep.
So with that in mind, like going to your talk about silos, I think you have to be holistic about it, Richard, right? Like you can't just say, well, the marketing team gets to do it this way, the security team wants it to be done this way, the DevOps team does it that way, the legal team gets a different thing. You need a holistic approach. And from my company, right, to plug a little, we look at that as a security fabric. Right? So you are protecting all of this data across endpoints, across servers, across networks, across applications, and you're also providing a platform for user education. You're also doing instant response, right? So you're building all of that into a single API, if you will, right? And really our vision is, I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't want to oversell it, but our vision is that your information security, your cybersecurity should be like your immune system. It should not be something that you have to sit there and make hard decisions about how this data should be handled, right? This should be built into the systems that are housing that data. And it should be built in such a way that it's self-healing and it's going to recognize threats and it's going to defend itself, right? And I don't think we're quite there yet, but I definitely think that's the direction that got me excited about coming on board at Fortinet, is that's the way that Fortinet is pushing towards.
Yep, agreed. And as these digital supply chains mature, right, as we connect more platforms, as more APIs proliferate, I think that the vision is more achievable now than it has been ever. And I don't necessarily think it's going to take 8-10 years to do it. No. This is something that kind of needs to get done. It needs to be prioritized. Hence the original question. Yeah.
I mean, because to me, the topic, right, of more data, more problems, right? Like I work with customers that they don't realize that all of their data is in an S3 bucket that's insecured, right? And they didn't even put it there. They had a third-party app developer that put it there, right?
Yep. Well, that's a whole other, what's so funny is as you keep talking, I'm like, oh, can of worms, oh, can of worms. I mean, this is very complex and it's super critical. Richard, what are some of the advancements that you've seen when it comes to data handling? I mean, I know, you've worked at companies that specialize in, identity access, new ways to control access and identity safeguarding. But what are some of the advancements that you've seen that are kind of moving the needle in your mind?
Well, I mean, one of the things, and again, Ben touched on it, was this idea of securing a platform, right? So I think we've all been dealing with systems where we're all trying to bolt security, bolt process, bolt things onto stuff as opposed to baking it in. I think that's one of the core things, is try to figure out if you can start with a platform that in some ways is secure by design, right? Because then in many ways the security is deep enough that hopefully it's not impacting necessarily the business processes. It's just in there, right? It's naturally secure at rest. It's naturally secure in transport. And that kind of all things within the platform, not everything is going to be in the platform. That's of course always the challenge, right? And I think there's one other thing that I guess I have been continually recommending to boards for years, probably at least 15 years, as I've seen mergers and acquisitions take maybe a company that's highly mature in some ways to the brink of disaster because of who they acquired and their state of unreadiness, right? And so, and EA was a good example of this. EA was on a buying spree. We were buying, game studios every, couple weeks we bought one. And the challenge is when somebody is largely, and I'm, not everybody is like this, but I'm going to say when a company wants to be acquired, there are certain behaviors that you can see over and over and over again, right? So they tend to be withholding capital investment. They tend to keep their OpEx down. And consequently, they are trying to figure out how long they can last in some ways without, investing in all of those things that really they should have invested in. And so the acquiring company all of a sudden picks up this company that has, very, very high risk in one form or another, maybe didn't do all the things they needed to do. And so one of the things we started doing in EDA, and I'd recommend it anywhere you can infuse this, is when they buy a company, they're plunking down big money. But once you get through the acquisition, then the company is rolled in, and now you're dealing with the same old budget you always had, now with yet another problem rolled in there, right? But the board can put that money, they can earmark money in the acquisition cost and force the fix as part of the due diligence cycle, right? And so you can push chunks of money to go fix it before it actually comes in and gets connected and the acquisition cost is closed out. And so that started actually, really safeguarding a lot of things. And it helped, certainly at EA, for us to maintain, I would say, an improving maturity, even though we were in an acquisition phase, right? Because we were basically taking on that risk up front.
That's pretty revolutionary, by the way. Because that's the other thing is by the way, it's things as, and it may not be inherent data risk, but it's just also a different model. I think acquiring Star in India, right? Things like that, and how do you fit them into your culture? But the idea also that you level up when you acquire, and you're like, no, wait a second, we're not gonna sink to the lowest common denominator. We're gonna lift them up and get them into our org in a successful way. I mean, that's the part where we can use M&A as a real tool to improve our industry. We should talk a little bit also in those conversations also about shared responsibility as well. Because not only are you inheriting that company and their customers, but you're also inheriting their entire vendor system, right? Who they work with, what they do, and sometimes it can even extend out into that from a weakest link. But let's talk a little bit. Can you talk about shared responsibility a little bit? And I'm sure both of you can, but I'm gonna pick on you, Ben. Just talk about the model.
So the idea of a shared responsibility model, right? Especially in a cloud sense, right? If I'm using public cloud offerings and I am going to rely on them to provide me with a secure infrastructure underneath my service, but ultimately your data can't be a shared responsibility. Your data belongs to you, right? If you collected it, if your app is designed to gather that data, that's on you, right? Like you can't point and say, well, but my cloud provider had a vulnerability, right? Like no one cares, right? Like so you as the data custodian or data owner have to protect that data. And if there is any shared responsibility with a service provider or a third party or a business partner, those people either contractually or otherwise, right, have to understand that the shared responsibility means you're working together to mitigate risks, but ultimately the buck does stop with the data owner or the asset owner, right? Because that's where the responsible party is.
True. Richard, you want to riff on shared responsibility at all?
Just, I mean, one piece of it is one of the things I've seen over and over is that I think in this world, as we're gathering data and throwing this data in these giant data lakes, right, or data swamps, sometimes the kind of perspective is all data is there to be exploited, right? And that's where certainly I've had to weigh in as an executive at times within these companies and go back to, as Ben says, the custodian and say, wait a minute, what rules did we and agreements with that customer did we gather this data, right? Because we may have gathered the data under, we will not sell this data. We will not use this data in this way. We will not, right? And yet, once it's in the data lake, right? It's almost up for grabs, right? Everybody's cutting through it in every possible way, and it's complete kind of mayhem in terms of exploitation. And so it's back to kind of this maturity where you have to say, okay, do you wind up creating these data swamps, or do you wind up having to have some form of in some ways, data classification? I know that sounds very governmental and pretty heavy-handed and pretty slow, and it definitely gets in the way of a lot of business agility. But you can start by starting focusing on the culture, right? If you set the right culture and expectation for how things are to be done, so back to sharing, back to say, what are we trying to achieve? Then it actually reduces the amount of hard walls and rules you have to set, because people will naturally kind of stay in the swim lanes. There will be, folks that get completely out of the pool, right? But generally, it comes back to culture internal to the company. The other thing that I was going to point out is that, this evolution or revolution is also cultural. Meaning, as technologically things have been enabled to gather more and more, have more and more kind of direct customer handshakes, that customer on the other end is evolving, right? And so that customer has different interactive behaviors, different expectations. Like, when they click on an I agree button, they don't necessarily agree with what they agreed to, right?
Yes.
And so you have to, in some ways, figure out, well, what's my customer and what's their expectation? What are they doing? And so that all feeds into this data and analysis, right? Because, as we know, many of these things in our behaviors and our attitudes are generational, right? And so I've certainly seen, let's say, the more mature teams, right, in age, have one perspective about how to do something. And then you have a younger, let's say younger generation team that has a completely different perspective and take on what they should be doing with that customer, what they should be putting in front of them, how they're interpreting what that customer is doing, and thinking, right? Everybody's after, what's that customer thinking? Right? And it's like, well, I don't know what they're thinking, but I can tell you what they're doing, right? And so that, that bridging that is really important.
Yeah, and look, we've been a one-way business, right? For 75 years, right? 85 years, whatever, right? Where it was like always just push it out there. Yeah, we don't care. We're just pushing it out. We're taking our money and walking.
Yeah, whether it's film, television, mostly television.
Yeah.
I mean, there was some feedback loop on television,
But one
not
way.
very directly. And music, right?
Yeah.
Certainly one way. And games when it was on discs. Right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Right? There wasn't pings back. But now you have this interactive piece to it. You're getting data. And I would say, forget about swamps, right? Our lakes and our pools became oceans, right? And I would say also when we think about that interactive element, like, how companies prepare for that tsunami from that ocean is critical, right? Because this is also where you have to have, it can't be humanly done. It's impossible to be humanly done. And so I'm curious also, when you think about kind of that evolution and where AI and ML really are taking us, besides the shiny dangly, like, ooh, look at this.
No.
There's practicality to all this. Go ahead, Ben.
Absolutely. So at Fortinet, we pull in threat data from literally 500,000 different devices and sensors on the internet, right? So every given quarter, we're pulling through petabytes of threat data that we're pulling in and ingesting. And even with hundreds of engineers looking at it, because of how much we get on a daily basis, minutely basis, right, it's humanly impossible to go through it, right? We could employ thousands more engineers than we do, and it wouldn't get done. And so with that, we do use a classifier. We do use a machine learning model to look through those threats and to basically sift through and get into kind of raw bucket to sifted bucket, and then that sifted bucket is looked at by a human analyst.
Of course.
And so essentially it gives us a force multiplier effect. But that also means that we have to be careful with not only how we gathered that data, but who we share that data with, right? So we're involved in the cyber threat exchange, right? And so we share that data in an anonymized fashion with other companies. We share it with Interpol. We share it with the FBI through InfraGard, right? So when we're sharing these things through these public-private organizations, we have to understand the data that's there, and we have to be able to either mask or anonymize it if it has sensitive information from the customer, right? And so part of that is baked into our process, right? So when we first collect the data, we're only collecting the things that are valuable for threat intelligence, for threat hunting. We are deliberately dropping any of the stuff from the customer environment because we don't want to report on the customer. We want to report on the threat actor.
Right. Right. And what it does, and we only have a couple minutes left, just FYI, I'm looking at the clock ticking down here. And we're all back here in this room for the next 2 sessions. But, I think what was so important about you guys leaning into this show also is understanding the security implications around that ginormous amount of data. And I think everybody gets the oh, okay, of course. But I don't think they're understanding some of the hidden issues. And maybe also in closing, maybe a couple of key ingredients that companies should look at, just some key takeaways, because people are already on this journey, right? And I think the other thing is as the problem grows, that's why I thought that M&A comment was so prescient, also Richard, right? Because we've got to simplify this, right? More data, more problems, stop the insanity. It's insane. So I wonder if you have a couple key takeaways that just to start thinking about it in a new way.
Yeah. So to allude to what Richard was saying about, I've always said this too, you really do need things to be secure by default. You don't want people to have to work into an exceptional process or be superhuman to safeguard your data. You want that safeguard to be baked in by design. You want these to be guardrails that, as you'd mentioned, kind of become a swim lane for people to where they are kept in a sort of safe middle zone. That's, I think, a key thing. And then I think encryption, both at rest and at transit, is absolutely essential. And tokenization can be another form of that. And then I also think that just understanding that no one threat model is going to fit everybody, and you have to really look at where the threats are coming from, what is the risk to your organization that you're trying to solve, and solve that. Don't try to build Fort Knox or don't try to protect nuclear launch codes if you're not Fort Knox and you're not nuclear launch codes, right? So just understand that there's a certain value to your assets, and you need your security controls to match that value, right? And then just lastly, what was good enough last month or last year is not good enough today because last week, yes, because not only is the business continuing to evolve and change, but the attackers are continuing to get more sophisticated and come after your data in different ways. I mean, everything from the Morgan Stanley breach where their old assets were being bought on the third-party market, and that's financial data that was lost for their investors.
Absolutely. I mean, every week there seems to be something new. And by the way, you don't hear about half of them. They don't even make the news. Richard, you got a key takeaway for businesses that are starting down this road and where they're going on the data side? And you'll have the closing comment.
Well, I think Ben handled the security side of things well. So I think I'll just swing over to the business, and I'd say, I think the danger in some ways of having all this data is, in some ways, the data nerds thinking that they can use the data to become creatives. I've kind of heard a few sessions where it's like, and this was the promise of research in the ad agency space, right? Is that I can tell you what's selling, right? And so if you want to make more of what's selling, that's fine. But the creative process, what actually sells is usually what's different, right? Yep. And the new hit song inevitably is going to have a riff you've never heard before. And that, right? And that's what the creative process is all about. And so I think from a business standpoint is figuring out how to leverage this to support the creative process as opposed to replace it.